through my eyes, the rise and fall of the British Empire. Imagine you are me. I am a traveler through time, and this is my story. I was there when the British Empire began its journey, a small island with big dreams. I watched as kings and queens rose to power, their ambitions stretching across oceans. Think of a young king, nervous but full of dreams. Maybe his people were hungry, and he wanted to bring them food from faraway lands. But maybe he also wanted to prove he was stronger than other kings. I saw sailors set sail, not knowing what lay ahead, their ships heavy with hope and greed. Imagine a sailor holding a letter from his mother. He doesn't know if he'll ever come back, but he dreams of gold and glory. My family once talked about someone like this, a sailor who left and was never seen again. I walked the streets of London as they bustled with merchants, soldiers, and explorers. I picture a young boy running through the streets, selling bread to soldiers. He dreamed of becoming a soldier himself one day, but his life was tied to these streets, not the battlefield. I felt the whispers of rebellion in the colonies and the weight of decisions made in grand palaces. Think of a man in India who works hard in the fields. One day he hears about a new tax that will take half his crops. His anger grows, and he joins others to protest. This is where rebellion starts. I stood in crowded markets in India, rich with spices and silk, and in quiet fields in Africa, where stories of sorrow and strength unfolded. I was there when treaties were signed, and I was there when wars broke out. I have seen the British Empire at its highest glory and its deepest fall. I remember visiting an old fort in Africa. A guide told me about his great-grandfather who worked there when the British ruled. He said his great-grandfather dreamed of freedom, even while serving the empire. This is not just history, it is my memory, my experience, and now yours. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and let me guide you through the story of an empire that shaped the world. Every rise, every triumph, every fall, you will feel it as I did. Together, let us step into the pages of time and uncover the truth behind one of the greatest empires in history. Come with me now as I step back in time. Picture it, a small island called England, looking out across vast seas, its ambitions reaching beyond the horizon. It was the late 16th and early 17th centuries, and I stood by as the first trading posts were built. Imagine a local child watching these strangers build on their land. His family is forced to sell their home for a few coins. He doesn't understand why everything is changing, but his life will never be the same. These humble beginnings, simple footholds in foreign lands, were the seeds of what would grow into the British Empire, the largest the world has ever seen. At its peak, it spanned continents, touching every corner of the globe. Over 400 million lives were bound to it, nearly a quarter of the world's population. It covered an unimaginable 24% of the Earth's land, so vast that the sun never set on its territories. But Britain wasn't the first to dream of empire. I remember the age of discovery. Portugal and Spain led the way, their ships braving unknown waters, their explorers carving out vast empires overseas. I felt England's envy, its determination to match their wealth and power. Soon, England joined forces with France and the Netherlands, all vying to establish colonies and trading networks. Wars followed, long, bitter wars with the Dutch and the French. By the end of it all, Britain emerged victorious. the dominant colonial force in North America. Then came India, a land rich in beauty, culture, and wealth. I was there in 1757 under the burning Indian sun as the East India Company defeated the Mughals at the Battle of Plassey. I picture an Indian soldier lying wounded after the battle, clutching a locket with his child's picture. He wonders if his sacrifice was for his land or for a foreign power that cares nothing for his family. That day marked Britain's rise as a power in India, and its empire expanded further. Yet, even as it grew, it suffered loss. The American colonies, Britain's oldest and most populous, rebelled. I stood in the thick of it, hearing cries for freedom that would not be silenced. Think of a British mother receiving a letter saying her son has died in America. He went to fight for the empire, but now she wonders if his life was wasted for a war they could never win. By 1783, Britain lost them, but the empire did not collapse. Instead, it turned its gaze elsewhere, to Asia, to Africa, and the Pacific, hungering for new opportunities. After defeating Napoleon in the early 19th century, Britain's naval power was unmatched. Its ships ruled the seas, its empire spreading wider and wider. Trade flourished, goods flowing like rivers across oceans. I saw the opium trade tighten its grip on China, and the tea trade from India grow stronger. It was the age of Pax Britannica, a time of relative peace, though not for everyone. Britain dominated not only its colonies but also world trade, enforcing its will in regions as far apart as Asia and Latin America. Even the Middle East came under its influence. But with this power came responsibility and tension. By the start of the 20th century, new powers were rising. Germany and the United States began to challenge Britain's supremacy, and then war. The First World War tested the empire as never before. I watched soldiers from across the colonies march to battle under Britain's flag. Imagine a soldier from Africa writing his last letter to his wife. He tells her to name their unborn child after him, knowing he won't survive the next battle. The letter never reaches her. The cost was staggering. Lives lost, resources stretched to the limit. After the war, the empire reached its greatest territorial size, yet its strength was already fading. Then came the Second World War. The Japanese seized Britain's colonies in East and Southeast Asia, shaking the empire to its core. Though victory was achieved, it came at a great price. The cracks in the empire had deepened. I can still see the crowds in India in 1947, their faces filled with joy and hope. Picture an elderly British officer packing his bags as India gains independence. He remembers the people he ruled, the cruelty he witnessed, and the friendships he lost. His heart is heavy with regret, but it's too late to make amends. India, Britain's most treasured colony, was now free. One by one, the empire's territories gained independence. I felt the shift, the end of an era. In 1956, the Suez Crisis made it clear that Britain was no longer a global superpower. By 1997, when Hong Kong was handed back to China, the British Empire was truly history. Still, its legacy lives on. Former colonies joined the Commonwealth, a group bound by shared history, culture, and ideals. I have walked through the triumphs and tragedies of this empire, stood in its palaces and its battlefields, and watched it rise to greatness and fall into memory. Now, I invite you to join me. Close your eyes, take a deep breath, and let me guide you through the journey of the British Empire. Every moment, every twist of history, it is all here, waiting for you. I remember the year 1578, a time of big dreams and restless ambition. Queen Elizabeth II, always thinking about England's future, gave Humphrey Gilbert permission to explore new lands across the seas. Gilbert, bold and full of determination, set out that same year for the Caribbean. He dreamed of being both a pirate and planting the first colony in North America. But fate had other plans. Before his ships could cross the big Atlantic Ocean, the voyage was stopped, leaving behind only thoughts of what could have been. Among the crew was a young boy, no older than 15. He joined the voyage to earn money for his sick mother. Every night, he sat alone, holding a letter she had written him. He whispered to it like it could give him strength. He told me his biggest dream was to return home with gold and medicine to save her. When the voyage failed, he sat quietly in a corner. He held the letter close to his chest and tried not to cry. "I promised her I'd come back as her hero," he said, his voice shaking. I will never forget the pain on his face. But Gilbert did not give up. In 1583, he set out again. This time I stood with him as he claimed the harbor of Newfoundland, a cold, rocky island at the edge of the New World. I saw a man fall to his knees on the shore. He picked up a handful of dirt and kissed it like it was treasure. He prayed loudly, asking that this land become a home for his family. But when we left, the land stayed empty, and his prayer was never answered. I still think about his tears. Gilbert's success did not last long. No one stayed to build homes on the land, and Gilbert himself died on the way back to England. His dream, however, lived on in his half-brother, Walter Raleigh. In 1584, Queen Elizabeth gave Raleigh permission to try again. That same year, Raleigh founded the Roanoke colony on the coast of what we now call North Carolina. I can still see the settlers, their faces full of hope and fear, trying to survive in this strange new land. One mother held her baby close every night. The baby was sick and food was running out. I heard her sing softly to the child under the stars, her voice filled with love and sadness. Each night, the baby's cries grew weaker. One night, the cries stopped altogether. The silence broke her heart, and it broke mine too. As time passed, a new century began, bringing new hope. In 1603, the crowns of England and Scotland became one when James VI of Scotland became James I of England. When he took the throne, I felt like the winds were changing. The next year, he made peace with Spain through the Treaty of London, ending years of war. I remember meeting a soldier after the treaty was signed. He had lost a leg in the wars with Spain. Now he walked with a wooden stick and looked much older than he was. "Maybe now my son won't have to fight like me," he said, his eyes filled with pain but also with hope. I have never forgotten his wish for peace, even though he had suffered so much. With peace, England turned its focus to building its own colonies instead of raiding others. In these early years of the 1600s, the British Empire slowly began to grow. I watched as brave men and women crossed the seas to build lives in North America and the Caribbean islands. Their first steps were small, but they were the start of something great. People began working together by creating joint stock companies, where they shared money and risks to make big plans happen. I remember one meeting of the East India Company, one of the most famous joint stock companies. A young man stood nervously in front of the group. In his hands was a small bag of coins, everything his family had. His mother had cried as she gave him the bag. "It will be worth it," he told her, though his hands shook. Years later, his gamble paid off. But I will always remember the look on his face that day. so full of fear and hope. The East India Company became one of the most important parts of Britain's trade and colonies. This time of growth, from the first colonies to the loss of the 13 colonies after the American War of Independence, was later called the First British Empire. It was a time of new beginnings, full of both victories and mistakes. And through it all, I was there, watching history unfold. Not just the big events, but the small, quiet moments of hope, struggle, and heartbreak that shaped the world. Stay with me, and I will take you deeper into this story, where every success and failure helped build the empire that was to come. Americas, Africa, and the slave trade. As I reflect on the British Empire's early attempts at colonization in the Americas, I find myself transported to the early 17th century. Imagine embarking on a ship bound for unknown lands, filled with dreams of discovery and wealth. In 1604, England's efforts to colonize the Americas began with a mix of hope and heartbreak. I picture myself among the explorers who set sail for Guyana, full of anticipation, only to return 2 years later with no gold and a heavy sense of failure. I remember speaking with a young sailor after the expedition failed. He had written letters to his wife, promising her riches and a new life. "How can I go back empty-handed?" he whispered, staring at the sea. His despair mirrored the disappointment of so many others who risked everything, only to return with nothing. Similar disappointment met the settlers of St. Lucia in 1605 and Grenada in 1609. Their dreams of a new beginning extinguished almost as quickly as they had formed, but not all hope was lost. In 1607, a determined group of settlers placed their trust in Captain John Smith and the Virginia Company, founding Jamestown. I imagine stepping off that ship onto foreign soil, the air thick with the promise of opportunity and the fear of the unknown. I picture a father stepping onto the land, holding his child close. "This is where we will begin again," he said, his voice shaking. The child clung to him, wide-eyed and silent, as they faced a world filled with both hope and danger. This settlement would endure against the odds, and by 1624, Jamestown had evolved into the royal colony of Virginia, the first lasting foothold of England in the Americas. I can feel the salty spray of the Atlantic as I picture the flagship of the Virginia Company, shipwrecked off Bermuda in 1609. The wreck was unintended, yet it led to England laying claim to the island. These moments of accidental colonization were often paired with stark failures, like the repeated struggles to establish a presence in Newfoundland's rugged terrain. In 1620, I find myself alongside the Pilgrims aboard the Mayflower, seeking freedom and sanctuary. Their prayers mingle with the cold Atlantic winds as they land at Plymouth, their determination unshaken. Their courage paved the way for others. In 1634, English Roman Catholics established Maryland. In 1636, Rhode Island became a haven for religious tolerance. And by 1639, Congregationalists had founded Connecticut. I can still hear the voice of a young woman on the Mayflower. She held a Bible close to her chest and whispered, "God will guide us, even if the land does not." Her faith was like a flame, small but unyielding, and it gave strength to those around her. Each of these colonies, born from spiritual and personal strife, stands as a testament to the resilience of these settlers. The scene shifts to the harbor of New Amsterdam in 1664. I watch as English ships sail in, cannons thunder, and the Dutch colony of New Netherland is claimed for England. Its capital is renamed New York, and I can only imagine the displaced Dutch settlers, their lives suddenly altered by imperial ambition. I remember the face of a Dutch merchant watching the English flags rise. "This is not just land," he said softly. "It is everything we've built, taken in a moment." His voice carried the pain of loss, shared by so many who had their lives turned upside down. This was a turning point, marking the growth of England's empire in North America. But the Caribbean, oh, how England's ambitions flourished there. St. Kitts in 1624, Barbados in 1627, and Nevis in 1628. Each settlement faced immense hardship, yet they endured. Then came the transformative Sugar Revolution. I feel the blistering Caribbean sun on my skin as I walk through vast sugarcane fields. The laborers toiled endlessly. First white indentured servants and later enslaved Africans, their lives bound to the relentless demands of the plantations. Barbados, in particular, became an economic powerhouse, its sugar plantations fueling immense wealth. The riches of these Caribbean ventures shaped the empire, leaving behind stories of triumph, exploitation, and transformation. I remember hearing the cries of an enslaved mother on a plantation. She sang softly to her child at night, a lullaby filled with sorrow and love. Her voice, broken yet determined, seemed to carry the weight of all those who suffered in silence. As I linger in these moments of history, I can't help but marvel at the resilience, ambition, and complexity that define these early chapters of the British Empire. I close my eyes and imagine the triangular trade route, a vast, complex system that turned human suffering into profit. Ships departed the African coasts, their hulls filled with enslaved men, women, and children. I feel the weight of despair on board as these captives, torn from their homelands, endured the horrors of the Middle Passage. I recall the trembling hands of a young boy as he clutched a small wooden carving, a gift from his father before they were separated. That carving, held so tightly, seemed to be the only piece of home he had left. These ships arrived in the Caribbean, their human cargo exchanged for sugar, and returned to Europe, laden with the fruits of forced labor. By 1651, England's Parliament decreed that only English ships could trade within its colonies, igniting the Anglo-Dutch Wars. These wars, though rooted in commerce, were battles for dominance over the seas. I can almost hear the roar of cannon fire as England claimed Jamaica in 1655 and the Bahamas in 1666, securing key positions in the Caribbean that would fuel its growing empire. Farther north, the cold winds of Rupert's Land carried whispers of opportunity. In 1670, the Hudson's Bay Company received a royal charter, giving it control over fur trading in this frozen land. I think of the traders, wrapped in heavy furs, moving through snowy forests and icy rivers. I imagine one of them, sitting by a small fire, holding a letter from home. His hands tremble as he reads his child's words. "Father, when will you come back?" The wilderness offered riches, but it also brought loneliness and longing for family. My grandfather once told me about a trapper he knew. The man said the hardest part wasn't the cold, but the silence. To pass time, he carved wooden toys for his children and sent them home, hoping they would remember him. The traders built forts, made agreements with indigenous communities, and braved the freezing cold, all while tensions grew with French fur traders in New France. At the same time, England's role in the transatlantic slave trade grew. The Royal African Company, started in 1672, controlled the trade of enslaved Africans to British colonies. By 1683, England controlled about 74% of this brutal trade. Cities like Bristol, Liverpool, and London became rich from it. I picture their docks, full of ships and merchants counting profits earned from unimaginable suffering. I hear the cries of an enslaved mother as her child is taken from her at the auction block. "Please, take me instead," she begs. But the merchant shrugs and continues tallying his money. This scene, though unbearable, happened thousands of times. I once stood in a museum, staring at a pair of small, rusted shackles. The guide told us about a girl who had marked each day she spent in chains. Seeing those marks made me realize how strong she had to be to survive. The conditions aboard the ships during the Middle Passage were terrifying. Enslaved Africans were crammed into dark, airless spaces. They were sick, starved, and terrified. I hear their muffled cries and whispered prayers for freedom. For many, the journey ended in death. About 1 in 7 enslaved people died before reaching the colonies. One survivor shared how, after weeks in darkness, they were finally brought above deck. "I thought I was already dead," they said, their voice heavy with sorrow. I remember reading Olaudah Equiano's story. He described the unbearable heat and smell of the ships. He said the misery was too much to describe, and that the memories stayed with him forever. By the 18th century, Africans made up 80% of the population in the British Caribbean and 40% in the southern 13 colonies. I imagine the sugarcane plantations where enslaved people worked under the hot sun. I picture a young boy in the fields, his hands raw and bleeding from cutting sharp plants. He looks up at the overseer, silently begging for rest, but the whip cracks in the air, forcing him to keep working. The wealth, from sugar, tobacco, and cotton, was enormous, but it left deep scars on history. I visited a plantation site once. The guide told us that children as young as 8 worked in the fields from sunrise to sunset. Standing there, I could almost feel the weight of their suffering in the silence around me. As I think about the early days of the empire, I see both hope and horror. The dreams of building a new world clashed with the suffering of those whose freedom was stolen. I imagine a wealthy British merchant at a grand dinner, boasting about his profits while far away, a family mourns for the freedom they have lost. There's an old saying in my family, "The soil remembers everything." It reminds me that behind every great fortune there are often hidden stories of pain and loss. The empire's foundations were built with both courage and cruelty. These mixed beginnings shaped an empire that would one day stretch across the world. At the end of the 16th century, we in England, along with the Dutch, began to challenge the Portuguese Empire's monopoly on trade with Asia. It was a bold step, requiring both teamwork and creativity. To pay for these expensive voyages, we created private joint stock companies. Ours was the English East India Company, started in 1600, and the Dutch made theirs in 1602. These companies were not just about exploration, but also fierce competition. They aimed to take part in the very profitable spice trade that had already made fortunes for those who controlled it. I imagine the air in London's coffee houses filled with the aroma of brewing coffee and the tension of whispered conversations. Investors gathered in clusters, their faces marked by a mix of excitement and fear. This venture could change everything, one might say, clutching a contract, or ruin us completely, another would reply, unable to hide the worry in their voice. I picture investors in London's crowded coffee houses, nervously pooling their money into these ventures. Their faces show a mix of hope and fear. Many of them had families depending on their success, making the risks feel very personal. I once read a diary entry from a merchant's wife. She wrote about how her husband invested everything they had in one voyage. She prayed daily for its success, knowing a single failure would leave their family ruined. He says the spices will bring wealth, she wrote, but I fear we are gambling with our children's future. Our focus was clear: the East Indies Islands and India. Both were important places in the world's trade routes. But despite our big dreams, the journey to success was full of problems. Portugal remained a strong rival, and the Dutch, with their advanced financial system, often got ahead of us. I imagine the frustration of English traders watching Dutch ships sail back laden with precious spices while ours returned empty or late. "How can we compete?" one captain might exclaim, his voice heavy with bitterness. "They have more ships, more money, and more experience." Their victories in the 3 Anglo-Dutch wars of the 17th century made their position in Asia even stronger. It sometimes felt like we were falling behind. I think of the merchants back in England, staring at dwindling ledgers and wondering if they had placed their faith in the wrong venture. "It's not just trade, it's survival," one of them might have said, his voice trembling with determination. I can still imagine merchants at the docks, quietly worrying about England's future in trade. One merchant might have muttered, "If the Dutch shut us out completely, what's left for us but ruin?" I can almost feel the tense silence that must have hung over those docks. Merchants, sailors, and dock workers would have shared nervous glances, each silently wondering if this was the end of England's trade ambitions. "We've come too far to fail now," one might have said, his voice betraying a mix of determination and fear. When I visited an old port, the guide showed us where merchants would gather to read shipping news. One story stood out: a ship returning empty after losing a race with a Dutch competitor. The sailors described how their hearts sank seeing the Dutch ship arrive first, taking all the goods. I remember standing there, imagining the sailors' frustration as they watched the Dutch crew unloading their cargo. One of them might have clenched his fists, muttering, "Next time we must win, we cannot afford another loss." A turning point came with the glorious revolution of 1688, when William of Orange, a Dutch prince, became King of England. Peace was finally made between England and the Netherlands. I still recall hearing about the negotiations that led to an agreement between the two nations. We split the trade. The Dutch kept control of the spice trade in the East Indies, and we focused on the textiles trade in India. I imagined the relief that must have swept through the merchant community. "At last, we can breathe," a trader might have said. But perhaps there was also a lingering doubt. Will textiles truly bring the wealth we need? It was a smart choice. Over time, textiles made far more money than spices, proving we had chosen wisely. I imagine an English trader in Madras, carefully examining colorful Indian cloth for the first time. He might have thought, "This will not only change our trade, be it also our way of life back in England." A historian once told me about a family in London who became wealthy selling Indian fabrics. They even named their shop after the town where the cloth was made. The fabrics didn't just bring wealth, they changed how people dressed and lived. I find myself thinking about that family, imagining their pride as their shop thrived. Perhaps they hung a map of India on their wall, pointing to the town their fortunes were tied to. "This cloth is more than fabric," they might have said. It's our legacy. The peace between England and the Netherlands allowed us to join the 9 Years' War as allies, fighting against France and Spain in a battle that stretched across Europe and the colonies. The Dutch had to focus much of their resources on the costly land war in Europe, but we took the chance to strengthen our navy and colonial positions. This change marked a big moment in our rivalry. I think of a young sailor boarding one of our ships, his eyes filled with a mix of fear and determination. "We must fight for our future," he might have said, clutching a letter from home that he would read and reread on lonely nights at sea. I imagine the sailors who worked on our growing navy, writing letters to loved ones they might never see again. "I fight not just for king and country," one might have written, "but for the hope that my family will one day live in a world shaped by peace." In one letter I read, a sailor described tying a locket with his child's picture to his uniform before setting sail. He carried it into every battle, hoping to survive for his family's future. I can almost feel the locket in his hand, a small yet powerful reminder of what was at stake. Perhaps he whispered a prayer over it before every battle, finding strength in the thought of his child's smile. Then, in 1700, Charles II of Spain died. His will gave the Spanish throne and its massive empire to Philip III of Spain, a grandson of the King of France. This decision threatened to upset the balance of power in Europe. A united France and Spain, along with their colonies, would create a dangerous empire. It was not just about pride for us. It was a fight to protect our survival. I picture the debates in Parliament where tension must have been palpable. "If we stand by and do nothing," a voice might have thundered, "our children will inherit a world dominated by tyranny." I imagine the silence that followed, each person weighing the gravity of those words. I once saw a painting showing a heated Parliament session from that time. The faces of the men in the room were lined with worry, as if the weight of the entire empire rested on their shoulders. To stop this threat, we teamed up with Portugal, the Netherlands, and the Holy Roman Empire to fight against the alliance of France and Spain. The War of the Spanish Succession began in 1701 and went on for 13 long years. It was a harsh and tiring war, demanding sacrifices and testing our strength. But the stakes were far too high to give up. A Franco-Spanish Empire ruling Europe and the Americas was something we could not allow. I imagine soldiers huddled around a campfire on a freezing night, their breath visible in the icy air. "We fight for a cause larger than ourselves," one might have said, his voice steady despite the hardships. "This war will decide the future of the world." I imagine a soldier writing in his diary during a bitterly cold winter campaign. "We fight on frozen ground, our stomachs empty, but our resolve unbroken. For if we fall here, our children may never know the freedom we defend." In a museum, I saw a musket from this war engraved with the words, "For my son." It reminded me of how much soldiers fought for their families, even when hope seemed distant. As I picture that musket, I think of the father who engraved it. Perhaps it was his final message, a declaration that even in war, his love for his family endured. I remember the day the Parliament of Scotland granted a charter to the Company of Scotland in 1695. There was a buzz of excitement in the air, and whispers of opportunity and wealth spread like wildfire. We all believed this was our chance, a chance to carve out our own place in the world, to stand tall alongside the English, the Dutch, and the Spanish. I imagine the bustling streets of Edinburgh, where traders, farmers, and aristocrats alike gathered, their dreams tied to this daring venture. "This is it," one hopeful investor might have said, clutching the charter. This is how Scotland will shine brighter than ever. The company's bold plan was to establish a settlement on the Isthmus of Panama, a land that promised riches and a strategic gateway between the Atlantic and the Pacific. I picture the maps spread across tables, marked with the word Darien, as if it were a treasure waiting to be uncovered. This land, the planners would declare, will be the heart of global trade, and Scotland will be its lifeblood. I can still picture the faces of the settlers in 1698 as they prepared for the journey. There was hope, determination, and maybe a bit of fear, but no one dared to voice it. The Darien colony was supposed to be a triumph, a testament to Scotland's strength. Among the settlers, I imagine young couples holding hands, their eyes bright with dreams of a better life. "We're going to build something great," they would say to each other, refusing to acknowledge the uncertainty that hung in the air. But the reality was far from the dream. The land was unforgiving. The sweltering heat clung to us, and the dense jungles teemed with challenges we hadn't anticipated. Malaria swept through our ranks like an unseen predator, claiming more lives than I dare to recount. I close my eyes and hear the cries of the sick, the whispered prayers of mothers cradling their dying children, begging for a miracle that never came. "We didn't come here to die," one man sobbed, his voice breaking the silence of the night. Supplies ran dangerously low, and the Spanish from nearby New Granada saw us as intruders. They surrounded us, cutting off any chance of getting help or reinforcement. Day by day, we struggled to survive, but the odds were not in our favor. I imagine the settlers gathered together at night, their faces thin and their spirits crushed. "When will this end?" a trembling voice might have asked in the darkness, filled with fear. There was an account of one settler who kept a small pouch of seeds, hoping to plant them when the colony thrived. By the end, he buried them in the soil, as if saying goodbye to his dreams. By the time the painful decision was made to leave the colony in 1700, the hope and energy that had driven us there had turned into bitter memories. We left behind not just the physical ruins of the colony, but also the emotional wreckage of shattered dreams. I see the defeated settlers as they stepped off the ships back in Scotland, their clothes torn and their eyes empty. "We gave everything," one survivor might have whispered, "and came back with nothing." Returning home didn't bring comfort. The financial loss of the Darien scheme was devastating. A quarter of Scotland's wealth had been poured into the project, and now it was all gone. I picture the merchants and investors who had risked their fortunes standing in silence, staring at empty coffers. "What do we have left now?" they must have asked, their voices weighed down by despair. One nobleman reportedly sold his estate to fund the scheme. When he returned, he found his family in ruins, his children asking, "What will we do now, Father?" The damage was not just about money. It shook the spirit of the entire nation. People began to question whether Scotland could stand on its own in this highly competitive world. The voices calling for unity with England grew louder. Many saw the Union as the only way to find stability and new opportunities. In 1707, after many debates and hard negotiations, the Acts of Union were signed, and Scotland and England became the Kingdom of Great Britain. I think often about the Darien scheme, not as a complete failure, but as a hard lesson. It was a painful reminder of the risks of ambition, but also a moment that helped shape our future as a united nation. I once heard a survivor say, "We lost more than gold. We lost our pride." but maybe this loss will lead to something greater in the end. As we moved into the 18th century, I marveled at how Great Britain rose to dominate the global stage. Our rivalry with France shaped much of the century's history. Together with Portugal, the Netherlands, and the Holy Roman Empire, we endured the grueling years of the War of the Spanish Succession. When the conflict finally ended in 1714 with the Treaty of Utrecht, the relief was immense. I remember the news spreading through the streets. Philip V of Spain had renounced any claim to the French throne. This crucial agreement ensured that Spain and France would not unite under a single crown, preserving the fragile balance of power in Europe. Though Spain lost much of its empire in Europe, we emerged with valuable rewards. From France, we claimed Newfoundland and Acadia, vital for controlling the North Atlantic. From Spain, we gained Gibraltar and Minorca. Gibraltar, in particular, became a jewel in our empire's crown, a fortress guarding the gateway to the Mediterranean. The treaty also granted us the lucrative Asiento, giving Britain the exclusive right to supply African slaves to Spanish colonies in the Americas. This dark and morally fraught trade brought immense wealth to British merchants, fueling the growth of cities like Bristol and Liverpool. I imagine a trader writing in his ledger, counting profits while ignoring the human cost. This is the price of empire, he might have rationalized, though history would not forget the suffering it caused. The peace was short-lived. In 1739, the Anglo-Spanish War of Jenkins's Ear broke out after years of rising tensions. Tales of Spanish privateers attacking British merchant ships spread like wildfire. I recall the anger that gripped the nation. "They cannot humiliate us and go unpunished," people cried. The war dragged on. But by 1746, peace negotiations began and Spain agreed to stop targeting our ships. Yet, with the Treaty of Madrid in 1750, we gave up the Asiento, marking a shift in the empire's economic strategy. Meanwhile, in the East Indies, the competition with the Dutch raged on. The spice trade, once the pinnacle of wealth, was overshadowed by the booming demand for textiles. By 1720, the English East India Company had outpaced its Dutch rivals, a testament to our growing global dominance. In India, the declining Mughal Empire created opportunities for European powers to fill the vacuum. Conflict erupted as the British and French East India Companies clashed for supremacy. The decisive moment came in 1757 at the Battle of Plassey. I remember the whispers of victory. "We've won Bengal." That battle, though fought by the company, signified more than a simple military success. It marked the beginning of British rule in India. Bengal became the heart of our Indian operations, its wealth funding further conquests. French ambitions in India dwindled after Plassey. They retained small enclaves, but their dreams of dominance were over. Through alliances, treaties, and the might of our presidency armies, the British East India Company steadily expanded its territory. I think of the Indian sepoys, the soldiers who fought under British officers. "We are fighting their wars," one might have said, but who will remember us? As Britain and France vied for power in India, their struggle extended across the globe. The 7 Years' War, 1756-1763, brought every major European power into fierce conflict. Its impact felt in Europe, the Americas, Africa, and Asia. It was a war for dominance, one that tested the limits of our empire. The Treaty of Paris in 1763 marked the war's end and sealed Britain's place as the leading global power. In North America, France's colonial ambitions were crushed. New France was ceded to Britain, bringing vast territories and a sizable French-speaking population under our control, Florida became ours, while Louisiana was handed to Spain. These acquisitions cemented our dominance in the Americas, though they also brought challenges, such as governing diverse populations and protecting vast borders. In India, our triumph over France solidified our position as the preeminent European power on the subcontinent. Our fleets dominated the seas, and Britain stood unrivaled in maritime strength. Looking back, I feel the weight of these transformations. The empire had grown larger than we could have imagined, reshaping the balance of power and carving a lasting place for Britain on the world stage. But with this growth came new challenges, new conflicts, and the ever-present question: how long could this empire endure? As we entered the 18th century, I marveled at the rise of Great Britain as the dominant colonial power on the world stage. France emerged as our principal rival, and the rivalry shaped much of what followed. Together with Portugal, the Netherlands, and the Holy Roman Empire, we persevered through the War of the Spanish Succession. The conflict spanned years, finally drawing to a close in 1714 with the Treaty of Utrecht. I recall the immense relief when Philip V of Spain renounced any claims to the French throne, ensuring that Spain and France would not unite under a single crown. Though Spain lost much of its empire in Europe, our efforts were rewarded with significant territorial gains. From France, we secured Newfoundland and Acadia. From Spain, we gained Gibraltar and Minorca. Gibraltar, in particular, became a jewel in our crown, a critical naval base giving us control over the vital Atlantic entrance to the Mediterranean. And there was the lucrative Asiento, granting us the rights to sell African slaves in Spanish America. Yet, these times were not without conflict. In 1739, the Anglo-Spanish War of Jenkins' Ear erupted, and I vividly remember hearing tales of Spanish privateers attacking our merchant ships along the triangle trade routes. The war dragged on, but by 1746, peace talks began, and Spain agreed to cease its attacks on our shipping. However, with the Treaty of Madrid in 1750, we reluctantly gave up our slave trading rights in Latin America, a significant shift in the economic landscape of the empire. Meanwhile, in the East Indies, competition with the Dutch continued. The trade in spices remained important, but textiles had begun to overshadow them. By 1720, the sales figures told the story. Our English East India Company had surpassed its Dutch counterpart. On the Indian subcontinent, the decline of the once mighty Mughal Empire created a vacuum of power. This tumultuous period saw numerous outbreaks of conflict as our company and the French East India Company vied for supremacy. The pivotal moment came in 1757 at the Battle of Plassey. I remember the whispers of triumph that spread after we defeated the Nawab of Bengal and his French allies. That victory left us in control of Bengal and established the British East India Company as a major military and political force in India. France retained its enclaves, but their military ambitions in India were curtailed. They were obliged to support our client states, effectively ending their hopes of domination in the region. Over the decades that followed, our company's influence expanded steadily. Whether through direct rule or alliances with local rulers under the threat of force, the territories under our control grew larger. The presidency armies, predominantly composed of Indian sepoys under British officers, became a powerful instrument of expansion. As I reflect, It's clear that the struggles between Britain and France and India were but one theater in a far larger conflict, the global 7 Years' War. From 1756 to 1763, the war brought nations across Europe and their colonies into fierce contention. The Treaty of Paris in 1763 marked the end of that turbulent chapter, with profound consequences for the empire. In North America, France's colonial ambitions were effectively extinguished. They ceded New France to us, which brought a sizable French-speaking population under our control. Rupert's Land and Florida also became ours, while Louisiana passed to Spain. These acquisitions cemented our position in the Americas. Our triumph over France in India and on the seas further underscored our maritime supremacy. By the end of the war, Britain stood as the world's most powerful maritime power. Looking back, I felt the weight of these transformations, an empire growing, reshaping the balance of power and carving its place on the global stage. As I reflect on the 1760s and early 1770s, a palpable tension fills the air, a growing strain between Britain and the 13 colonies across the Atlantic. The heart of this conflict lay in the colonists' deep-seated resentment of the British Parliament's efforts to govern and tax them without their consent. Their rallying cry, "No taxation without representation," echoed a profound sense of injustice, a perceived breach of the rights of Englishmen that they believed were their birthright. This unrest gradually escalated, evolving into outright rejection of parliamentary authority and a bold push for self-government. Watching these events unfold, I felt the simmering defiance begin to boil over. Britain responded decisively, deploying troops to reassert direct control, but this only fanned the flames. By 1775, war erupted, a rebellion that began as murmurs of dissent had grown into the roar of the American Revolution. Then came the pivotal moment. In 1776, the Second Continental Congress issued the Declaration of Independence. With that, the colonies proclaimed their sovereignty, severing ties with the British Empire to form a new nation, the United States of America. I remember the shockwaves this sent rippling through the empire. As the war dragged on, the entry of France and Spain into the conflict tipped the scales against Britain. A devastating defeat at Yorktown in 1781 left us with little choice but to negotiate peace. 2 years later, at the Peace of Paris in 1783, we formally recognized American independence. Losing such a significant portion of British America, then our most populous overseas possession, felt like a monumental shift. Many historians see this as the turning point, the moment that marked the transition from Britain's first empire to its second. With the Americas lost, our gaze turned eastward towards Asia, the Pacific, and later, Africa. This transition was not without its intellectual underpinning. I recall the publication of Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations in 1776, its arguments fresh and revolutionary. Smith challenged the old mercantilist policies that had defined our early colonial expansion, advocating instead for free trade. Colonies, he claimed, were unnecessary burdens. The burgeoning trade between Britain and the newly independent United States after 1783 seemed to vindicate his views, showing that economic prosperity did not require political control. The repercussions of the war reached far beyond the United States, shaping our policies in Canada. Tens of thousands of loyalists, those who had remained faithful to the crown, fled the newly formed United States, seeking refuge within British-controlled territories. Between 40,000 and 100,000 loyalists migrated, with around 14,000 settling in the St. John and St. Croix river valleys of Nova Scotia. Their isolation from the provincial government in Halifax led to the creation of New Brunswick as a separate colony in 1784, a measure intended to better address their needs. In 1791, the Constitutional Act sought to ease tensions between French-speaking and English-speaking communities in Canada. This act divided the territory into two provinces: Upper Canada, predominantly English-speaking, and Lower Canada, primarily French-speaking. Each was granted a system of governance modeled on Britain's own, designed to assert imperial authority and prevent the rise of popular control, an element blamed for the American Revolution. As time passed, relations with the United States grew tense once more, particularly during the Napoleonic Wars. Britain, seeking to weaken France, disrupted American trade and boarded their ships, impressing men into the Royal Navy. These actions provoked outrage, culminating in the United States Congress declaring war in 1812. The War of 1812 brought its own trials. The United States invaded Canadian territory, prompting a swift and firm British response. Our forces retaliated, even invading American soil. Yet, despite the conflict, the Treaty of Ghent in 1814 reaffirmed the pre-war boundaries, ensuring that Canada's destiny would remain separate from that of the United States. Looking back, these events are a testament to the resilience and adaptability of the empire. Even as challenges mounted and the map of the world shifted, Britain found ways to endure, to evolve, and to lay the foundation for the next chapter of its story. As I close my eyes and recall the history of transportation and exploration, a vivid picture forms in my mind. Since 1718, transportation had been a common punishment in Britain, with around 1,000 convicts sent yearly to the American colonies. It was a practical solution, a way to deal with offenders while simultaneously bolstering colonial populations. But with the loss of the 13 colonies in 1783, a new solution had to be found. It was during this search that the British government turned its gaze toward Australia. I think of James Cook embarking on his voyages of discovery commissioned by the Crown itself. On his first expedition, he reached the shores of New Zealand in October 1769, becoming the first European to circumnavigate and map its landscape. New Zealand, so beautiful and untamed, attracted explorers, missionaries, traders, and adventurers. Yet, despite these visits, no settlements were established. Australia's story unfolded differently. The Dutch had first sighted its coast in 1606, but they made no effort to colonize it. Cook's journey changed everything. After leaving New Zealand in 1770, he charted the eastern coast of Australia, claiming the continent for Britain and naming it New South Wales. I can almost hear the winds against the sails and the quiet murmur of sailors as they gazed upon these uncharted lands. In 1778, Joseph Banks, Cook's botanist, presented his findings to the British government, advocating for the establishment of a penal colony at Botany Bay. The first fleet of convicts set sail in 1787, arriving the following year. It's extraordinary to think how this began, a colony claimed through proclamation. Indigenous Australians, viewed by the colonizers as too uncivilized to warrant treaties, faced devastation. Disease, violence, and the dispossession of their lands tore through their communities, leaving lasting scars. Convict transportation to New South Wales continued until 1840, to Tasmania until 1853, and to Western Australia until 1868. Despite these grim beginnings, the Australian colonies flourished. They became significant exporters of wool and gold, driven by the Victorian gold rush. Melbourne, at the height of this prosperity, was briefly the richest city in the world. Meanwhile, Britain's ambitions extended beyond Australia. I think of the North Pacific, where Spain and Britain vied for dominance. The Nootka crisis in 1789 brought them to the brink of war, but Spain, left unsupported by France, had no choice but to relent. The Nootka Convention that followed humiliated Spain, effectively ending its claims to sovereignty along the North Pacific coast. With this, the door to British expansion swung open. I imagine George Vancouver on his naval expeditions, charting the intricate inlets of the Pacific Northwest, particularly around Vancouver Island. On land, bold explorers sought to find a river route to the Pacific, expanding the fur trade in North America. In my mind's eye, I see Alexander Mackenzie of the Northwest Company as he embarked on his journey in 1792. A year later, he became the first European to reach the Pacific Ocean overland, north of the Rio Grande, near what we now call Bella Coola. This was a full 12 years before the famed Lewis and Clark expedition. Shortly after, Mackenzie's companion John Finlay established the first permanent European settlement in British Columbia, Fort St. John. These were not solitary achievements. The Northwest Company, eager for more exploration, supported expeditions by David Thompson beginning in 1797, and later by Simon Fraser. Their ventures pushed further into the wilderness, through the Rocky Mountains and the interior plateau, eventually reaching the Strait of Georgia on the Pacific coast. Step by step, the map of British North America expanded westward, opening a new chapter of opportunity and challenge for the empire. As I delve deeper into the past, I find myself transported to the southern reaches of India, where the East India Company waged a series of wars against the Sultanate of Mysore. It began with the formidable Hyder Ali, a ruler known for his military prowess. The First Anglo-Mysore War brought defeat to the company, and the Second War ended in a tense stalemate. I can almost sense the uncertainty in the air during those years, the lingering apprehension of battles yet to come. The tides began to turn with the Third Anglo-Mysore War. It was as if the company had regained its footing, and their victory in this conflict paved the way for what was to follow. I imagine the scene in 1799 during the Fourth Anglo-Mysore War, the siege of Seringapatam, when Tipu Sultan, the Tiger of Mysore, met his end. With his death, Mysore's fate was sealed, and the kingdom became a protectorate of the East India Company. The balance of power in the region shifted dramatically, and the once mighty Mysore found itself under British control. As I reflect, my thoughts turn to the Maratha Confederacy, another formidable adversary of the company. The Anglo-Maratha Wars spanned decades, each conflict shaping the future of the Indian subcontinent. The First Anglo-Maratha War, which ended in 1782, saw little change. The pre-war status quo was restored, leaving tensions unresolved, a fragile peace hanging in the air. But the Second and Third Anglo-Maratha Wars were a different story altogether. The company's victories in these conflicts marked the decline of Maratha power. I envision the final moments of the Third War in 1818 when Peshwa Bajirao II surrendered, a symbolic end to Maratha resistance. The East India Company now controlled a vast expanse of the Indian subcontinent, its influence spreading like ripples across the land. Each victory and treaty brought new challenges and opportunities for the company, shaping not just India's destiny, but the very identity of the British Empire. As I breathe in the calm, I marvel at how these events, one by one, created the intricate tapestry of history. wars with France. As I continue my journey through history, I find myself amidst the dramatic clash between Britain and France during the Napoleonic Wars. This wasn't just a war of armies. It was a contest of ideologies, a struggle that reached deep into the souls of these two nations. Napoleon Bonaparte loomed as a figure of immense power and ambition, threatening not just Britain's global influence, but even its very shores. His victories across continental Europe sent ripples of fear and determination across the Channel. I picture the immense effort Britain poured into this conflict. Vast amounts of capital and resources were marshaled as the stakes had never been higher. The Royal Navy, that steadfast guardian of the seas, became Britain's strongest shield. I can almost hear the waves crashing against the hulls of mighty ships as British vessels blockaded French ports, isolating Napoleon's forces. The tension of battle builds in my mind as I recall the decisive victory at the Battle of Trafalgar in 1805, where the Royal Navy crushed a combined fleet of French and Spanish ships. Across the world, the war extended far beyond Europe. I see British forces striking at overseas colonies, seizing control of territories, and disrupting Napoleon's plans. Even the Netherlands, annexed by France in 1810, could not escape Britain's reach. I imagine the resolve of Britain, its allies united in purpose, as they mounted a coalition effort to finally bring Napoleon to his knees in 1815. With the echoes of war silenced, Britain emerged as a beneficiary of the ensuing peace treaties. I can almost trace my fingers across a map, noting the spoils of war. From France, Britain gained the Ionian Islands, Malta, Mauritius, St. Lucia, the Seychelles, and Tobago. Spain relinquished Trinidad, while the Netherlands ceded Guyana, Ceylon, and the Cape Colony. Even the Danish handed over Heligoland. And yet, as the ink dried on these treaties, Britain also returned certain territories, Guadeloupe, Martinique, French Guiana, and Réunion to France, Minorca to Spain, the Danish West Indies to Denmark, and Java and Suriname to the Netherlands. The balance of power was carefully recalibrated, a web of give and take that marked the end of one of history's most profound conflicts. As I reflect, I marvel at the resilience of nations, the shifting borders, and the enduring struggle for supremacy. Each victory and concession is like a step forward and back in the dance of history, leaving behind legacies that continue to shape the world we know today.